Hey everyone, this is Allison with Allison Knows. Thank you for joining me for a quick special episode update. This particular episode we're going to call Political Purgatory, and it's exposing the seven deadly sins poisoning America's soul. So I wrote this up and I'm going to read it because it took a little bit of research, and I won't lie to you, I have too much going on to commit all this to memory. So here we go. It says, exposing the seven deadly sins poisoning America's soul. I look at this as a social commentary, and I hope you are working with me on this and you get it as I do. So here we go. I'm Allison. Welcome. This is a special episode of Allison Knows. Tonight, we are going to talk about something that might sound a little unusual for a political show. We're going to talk about sin, not the kind of sin that gets preached about on Sunday mornings, but the kind that's been eating away at the foundation of America's democracy, like termites in the walls of a house that looks fine from the outside but is rotting from within. Interesting word, rotting. Interesting word, rotting. Okay. Now, I want you to stay with me here because this isn't going to be a sermon. This is going to be an investigation. And like all good investigation, it starts with a pattern that once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's what I want you to consider tonight. What if the chaos we're witnessing in American politics isn't random? What if the dysfunction and the corruption and the seemingly endless cycle of scandal and outrage isn't just the natural result of a polarized society, but something more systemic, something more ancient? I want to tell you about a framework that medieval scholars used to understand human moral failures. They called them the seven deadly sins: pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. Seven fundamental ways that human beings go wrong, seven patterns of behavior that, if left unchecked, destroy not just individuals, but entire communities. Like I said, stick with me here. When you see this and you get it online and you watch it, if you watch the replay, I want you to send me your questions, send me your comments, because a lot of you send questions to me. And this is how I go about my research, and I go about pulling up information that we have forgotten. So, yeah. The thing that's been keeping me up at night, and I have serious insomnia, so yes, it's been keeping me up at night. These aren't just personal feelings anymore. They've become the operating system of American politics. Now, let's talk about the first cycle. The first cycle is pride. Not just the good kind of pride, like being proud of your country or your family's achievement. I'm talking about the toxic kind, the kind that medieval theologians call superbia, the excessive love of self that makes you believe you're incapable of error, that makes you think the rules don't apply to you, that makes you prioritize your own image over the truth. Starting to see it, aren't you? So think about what we've witnessed over the past several months. And then think about what we have experienced and witnessed over the past years. Politicians who refuse to admit they lost elections, even when presented with overwhelming evidence. Leaders who fire anyone who tells them the uncomfortable truth. That's hitting close to home now, isn't it? Okay. Officials who would rather let people die than acknowledge they made a mistake about a pandemic response. This isn't just stubbornness. This is pride in its most destructive form. And it's becoming a feature, not a bug, of how our political systems operate. Wow. Right about now, I miss Samantha the Good Witch, so she could just use her wand and poof, things would be back to some sort of semblance and the chaos will be tempered a little bit. Here's what pride looks like in practice. In 2020, we watched the election officials in multiple states receive death threats for simply doing their jobs, counting votes and certifying results. Why? Because acknowledging the reality of those vote counts would have required certain political figures to admit they were wrong. And pride, political pride, simply won't allow that. Now, here is where it gets really insidious. Pride doesn't just affect individual politicians, it creates entire ecosystems of establishment, MAGA. When a leader's pride becomes more important than the truth, everyone around them has to choose to tell the truth and get fired, or participate in the lie and keep your job. We've seen this pattern play out in administration after administration in both parties, though the scale and consequences have varied dramatically. The pride of one person at the top cascades down through an entire organization, creating what psychologists call groupthink, where the need to maintain the leader's image becomes more important than making good decisions. Yeah, it gets bad. And the cost is what we stop being able to solve problems because you can't fix what you won't admit is broken. You can't learn from mistakes you refuse to acknowledge. You can't build trust with people when your primary concern is protecting your own reputation rather than serving their interests. So our representatives are no longer our representatives. Our representatives have now become self representatives. The second cycle and circle is greed. Now let us talk about greed. And I want to be clear about something from the start. This is not about people wanting to make a living or even wanting to be successful. This is about the kind of greed that turns public service into personal enrichment, that treats government positions as opportunities of financial gain rather than civic duty. Mitch McConnell, $33 million rich. Yeah. Here's a number I want you to remember, 3.7 billion. That's how much was spent on federal lobbying in 2023 alone. 3.7 billion spent by corporations, trade organizations, and special interest groups to influence the decisions of the people we elected to represent us. Now, lobbying itself isn't necessarily corrupt. In theory, it's just a way for different groups to make their case known to lawmakers. But here's what happens when greed enters the equation. The loudest voice becomes the one with the most money, not necessarily the one with the best ideas or the most people behind them. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works. In 2019, a pharmaceutical company spent $4.7 million on lobbying efforts related to drug pricing legislation. That same year, Congress failed to pass meaningful drug pricing reform, despite overwhelming public support for it. Coinciding, maybe, but when you see this pattern repeating across issue after issue, climate change, healthcare, financial regulation, you start to understand that we're not looking at coincidences. We're looking at a system. And it's not just about lobbying, it's about the revolving door between government and industry, former regulators who go to work for the companies that they used to regulate, former lawmakers who become lobbyists for the industries they used to oversee, current officials who make decisions with one eye on their future job perspective. So if they are in office to serve us, and they're looking for their golden parachute after they've left public service, where do you think they're going to land? Their future job prospects. This is greed institutionalized. It's the transformation of public service from a calling into a career strategy. And the result is that policy gets made not based on what's best for the American people, but based on what is most profitable for the people making the decisions. That sucks. That sucks. That sucks. And here's really what gets me about political greed. It's not even particularly well hidden anymore. We have members of Congress who openly trade stocks in companies that are directly affected by their legislative decisions. We have officials who take speaking fees from organizations that have business before their agencies. We have a system where the appearance of corruption has become a normalization that actually corrupts barely registered, and it is a little blink. And the only thing that allows us to see it is when it becomes scandalous. The third circle is wrath. Now, the new regime has been in office since January 2025. Today is August 7th, 2025. And it feels like 10 years. Now, there are a lot of ways to actually measure how that translates into 10 years, but at the same time, it allows us to realize just how human we are and what our failings are. Because right now, citizenship is now being redefined in what is important, what is life changing, and what we will tolerate or not tolerate. So, wrath. If you've been on social media at all in the past few years, if you've watched cable news, if you have attended a town hall meeting or a school board meeting, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Wrath isn't just anger. Anger can be righteous, anger can be productive. Anger at injustice has driven some of the most important social movements in American history. Wrath is different. Wrath is anger that becomes an end in itself. Wrath is anger that's more interested in destroying enemies than solving problems. And wrath has become the fuel that powers our political system. Here's how it works. Politicians discover that nothing motivates their base quite like rage. Not hope, not policy proposals, not vision for the future. Rage. So they feed it. They find new things for people to be angry at. They turn policy disagreements into existential threats. They turn political opponents into enemies of the state. And the media, and I will include myself in this as independent media, we have discovered that nothing drives ratings quite like outrage. Calm, reasoned decision doesn't get clicks. Nuanced analysis doesn't go viral. But righteous indignation, that's engagement gold. So we've created this feedback loop where politicians get rewarded for making people angry and the media gets rewarded for amplifying that anger, and social media algorithms get rewarded for showing people content that makes them angrier. So the cycle keeps going. Joy. The result is what we have weaponized one of humanity's most destructive emotions and made it the organizing principle of our democracy. Yeah. Let me show you how and what this looks like in practice. In the past 5 years, we have seen elected officials receive death threats at unprecedented levels. Election workers have been harassed and threatened for doing their jobs. Public health officials have been driven from their positions by angry mobs. School board members have resigned rather than face the wrath of parents who have been told that teaching about racism is somehow equivalent to child abuse. Yeah, well, I bet you the Epstein files are something for everyone to be interested right about now. This isn't democracy. This is mob rule. And mob rule is what happens when wrath becomes more important than wisdom, when the desire to punish becomes more powerful than the desire to govern. Here's where the reality is really showing its insidious self. Wrath doesn't just destroy the targets of the anger, it destroys the people who carry it. When you're constantly angry, when you're always looking for the next thing to be outraged about, you lose the capacity for the kind of careful thinking that democracy requires. You lose the ability to compromise, to see nuance, to change your mind when presented with new evidence. Wrath makes you stupid. And a democracy full of stupid, angry people is not a democracy that can solve complex problems. The level of critical thinking diminishes. The fourth circle, envy. Now we come to envy. And envy in politics is particularly toxic because it masquerades as justice. It prides itself and presents itself as a righteous anger at inequality, as legitimate frustration with system or with a system that seems rigged. And sometimes that's exactly what it is, sometimes. But envy takes those legitimate concerns and twists them into something destructive. Envy says, if I can't have what they have, then they shouldn't have it either. Wow. Envy says their success must mean my failure. Envy turns politics into a zero-sum game where someone else's gain is automatically your loss. Yeah. We see this playing out across the political spectrum. On the right, it's the resentment towards coastal elites, towards people with college degrees, towards anyone who seems to be benefiting from globalization or technological change. On the left is the anger towards billionaires, towards anyone who succeeded in the current system, towards anyone who doesn't acknowledge their privilege. And here's the thing, some of these grievances are legitimate. Income equality is real. It is a living, breathing thing. Educational and cultural divides are real. Your ignorance is your fault. The system is rigged in many ways, but envy takes these real problems and offers fake solutions. Instead of figuring out how to create more opportunity for everyone else, envy says, let's just tear down the people who have had what we want. This is how you get politicians promising to own the libs or eat the rich, instead of actually proposing policies that would improve people's lives. This is how you get movements that are defined more by who they hate than by what they hope to achieve. Wow, doesn't make us look good at all. The fifth circle, lust. Now, I'm sure you can understand this part. Lust in politics isn't just about sex scandals, though we have certainly had plenty of those. Hashtag the Epstein Files. Political lust is about the insatiable appetite for power, for attention, for control. It is about politicians who can't resist the spotlight, who can't step back even when stepping back will be better for the country. We've all seen it. The politicians who stay in office decades past their prime, Mitch McConnell, Chuck Grassley, Chuck Schumer, because they couldn't or can't bear to give up the power. Clarence Thomas, Justice Alito, Donald Trump. The officials who turn every tragedy into an opportunity for self-promotion. The leaders who make every issue about themselves. Donald Trump. This kind of lust creates a political culture where everything becomes formative, where governing becomes secondary to being seen governing, where the appearance of action becomes more important than actual events. Wow. The sixth circle, gluttony. Now, gluttony in politics is easy. It's about access. It's about excess, actually, not access. It's about the insatiable appetite for more power, more resources, more control, just more. It's about government programs that grow beyond all reason, bureaucracies that exist primarily to perpetuate themselves, spending that continues regardless of results. Also, the reverse, which is the taking of everything that we saw before. The taking away of healthcare, the taking away of education, the taking away of fill in the blank. But it's also about the gluttony of consumption while others go without. It's about politicians living lavishly while their constituents struggle. It's about the obscene wealth that flows through political campaigns while basic infrastructure crumbles. Michael Johnson, Louisiana, $13 million rich in one of the poorest states in the United States. Yeah. The seventh circle, sloth. And finally, we come to sloth. Political sloth isn't just about laziness. It's the abdication of responsibility. It's the refusal to do the hard work of governing. It's the preference for symbolic gestures over substantive action. We see this in Congress's inability to pass budgets on time year after year. We see this in them shutting down the government. We see this in them recessing early because they do not want to open up the Epstein files. We see it in the failure to address long-term challenges like climate change, infrastructure decay, or Social Security solvency. We see it in the tendency to kick decisions, difficult decisions, down the road, to leave problems for the next administration, the next Congress, the next generation. Political sloth is about civic sloth, the failure of citizens to engage meaningfully with democratic processes. It is about voting based on party labels rather than candidate qualifications. It's about getting political information from social media memes rather than actual reporting. It's about the spiritual laziness that allows democracy to decay through neglect. It is simply about being stupid when you need to tap into critical thinking. The way out of this. Now, here we are in what I'm calling political purgatory, a place where these seven deadly sins have become not just individual failings, but systemic features of how our democracy operates. Pride that prevents learning from mistake, greed that turns public service into private enrichment, wrath that destroys the possibility of reasoned discourse, envy that makes politics a zero sum game, lust for power that makes everything performative, gluttony that consumes resources while problems go unsolved, and sloth that allows all of this to continue through sheer inertia, ignorance. But here's the thing about purgatory, at least in the medieval conception of it. It's not permanent. It's a place of purification, a place where souls work to overcome their sins and move towards something better. The question is, are we willing to do the work? Because recognizing these patterns is just the first step. The harder work is figuring out how to build systems that reward virtue instead of vice. How do we create incentives for politicians to tell the truth instead of telling people what they want to hear? How do we reward service, public service specifically, instead of self service? How do we encourage reasoned debate instead of performative outrage? These aren't just political questions, these are moral questions. These are questions we need to ask ourselves as a citizen of this country. There are questions about what kind of people we want to be and what kind of country we want to live in. If we expect our representatives to do the work, we need to do the work to find the right representatives to represent us. That is what we need to do. And the current regime has shown us that these changes don't have to take years. They do not have to take decades. They can be done in months, weeks, and days. So I think the hardest step is the decision. I think that the hope is there. These sins aren't inevitable, they're choices. Everyday politicians choose whether to prioritize their ego or the truth. Everyday citizens choose whether to engage thoughtfully with complex issues or treat themselves to comfortable anger. So every day we choose whether to feed these destructive patterns or starve them. Every day we choose to keep Donald Trump in office or ignore him. One of the things he said when he was campaigning is, what do we have to lose? Well, everything. That's what we have to lose. The seven deadly sins have been with humanity for as long as we've been human, and so have the virtues that oppose them. Humility instead of pride, generosity instead of greed, patience instead of wrath, gratitude instead of envy, temperance instead of lust and gluttony, diligence instead of sloth. These virtues exist in our political system also. We see them in the election workers who do their jobs despite death threats. We see them in people like Bernie Sanders, AOC, Jasmine Crockett, Elizabeth Warren, Maxwell Frost. Too many to name. There are a number of them. Jolanda Jones from Texas. It is important that we see them in the public servants who choose truth over career achievement. We see them in the citizens who take the time to understand complex issues instead of settling for simple answers. The question is whether we're going to nurture these virtues or continue to reward the sins, because we make no mistake in this choice. It is definitely a choice. The political mess we're in isn't some natural disaster that happened to us. It's the predictable result of the choices we've made individually and collectively about what we value and what we reward. We can choose differently. We can demand better. We can be better. But only if we're willing to look honestly at where we are, how we got here, and only if we're willing to call sin by its name and virtue by its name. Only if we're willing to do the hard work of moral and political reform. Donald Trump has already destroyed our government. So the rebuilding, it's not going to be easy, but at least now the site has been demolished. So clear the foundation, check the foundation, and begin to rebuild. The seven deadly sins are winning right now, but they don't have to win forever. That's our choice. That's our responsibility. That's our hope. And that's what I'm going to leave you with. This has been a special episode of Allison Knows. I am Allison. Thank you for watching. And thank you for caring enough about our democracy to think seriously about how we might save it. Good night.